In all quiet on the Western Front, the German soldiers fear artillery. They fear gas. They fear the mud that swallows men and the shells that never stop. The 2022 film is brutal, and it gets a lot of the German experience right. But here's what it completely ignores. There was one specific moment in the First World War that didn't just frighten German soldiers. It broke something in them. The real story of the first time German troops saw tanks is so much darker than anything that film shows you. To understand why, you need to understand what the Western Front actually was by 1916. A 475-mile line of trenches, running from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. 2 years old, completely unmoved. On one side, British and French forces. On the other, the German Imperial Army. Neither side could advance, and every method tried to break the stalemate had failed catastrophically. Here's the key thing. The trench system wasn't just a ditch. It was a machine designed to kill attackers. A front trench, a support trench, a reserve trench. 50 meters of barbed wire in front of each position. Concrete machine gun posts that could cut down 1,000 men in minutes. And any attacking soldier had to cross open ground, no man's land, to reach them. The British had tried artillery. The logic was straightforward. Bombard the German trenches for days before an attack. Destroy the wire. Kill the machine gunners before your infantry goes over the top. It didn't work. On July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British fired over 1.7 million shells across 7 days. The German wire was barely touched. The concrete bunkers were intact. The machine guns were waiting. That single day, the British suffered 57,415 casualties. Not over a week. 1 day. The Western Front had killed every solution anyone had tried. What the British needed was something that could cross no man's land without dying. Something that barbed wire couldn't stop. Something that bullets simply bounced off. They needed a weapon that had never existed before in human history. The idea didn't come from a general. It came from a soldier and a journalist. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton was a British officer serving as an official war correspondent on the Western Front. He watched the carnage. He understood the problem. And, in October 1914, barely 10 weeks into the war, he wrote a memo, proposing an armored, tracked vehicle that could cross trenches and crush wire. The army rejected it. Twice. Here's where it gets interesting. The idea reached Winston Churchill. Not Prime Minister Churchill. This is 1914. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. The Navy had nothing to do with land warfare, but Churchill was obsessed. He personally funded the development of what he called land ships armored vehicles that could cross any terrain. He set up the Land Ships Committee in February 1915 and spent £70,000 of Navy money without telling the Army to build the first prototype. The Army found out. Churchill was forced to hand the project over. But without him, tanks probably don't exist. The first working prototype, called Little Willie, was tested in September 1915. It couldn't cross a trench. Back to the drawing board. The second prototype was different, a rhombus shape on continuous tracks. Officially named His Majesty's Land Ship Centipede, informally called Big Willie. It was tested in January 1916. It crossed trenches. It crushed wire. Rifle fire bounced off it like rain. General Haig watched the demonstration and ordered 100 immediately. Now, here's something almost nobody knows about the word tank. The vehicles needed to be shipped to France in complete secrecy. Factory workers were told they were building water storage tanks for British forces in Mesopotamia. The crates were labeled tanks. The cover story stuck. When German intelligence filed their first reports about strange armored vehicles being shipped to the front, they used the same word the British workers used to disguise them. The name invented to hide the weapon from German spies became the word that defined armored warfare forever. This matters because it tells you something crucial. The Germans knew something was coming. They had intelligence reports, vague ones, inaccurate ones. Sketches that bore almost no resemblance to reality. They knew, and they still had absolutely no idea what it actually was. The date, September 15th, 1916. The Battle, Flers-Courcelette, a phase of the ongoing Somme offensive. 49 Mark I tanks were allocated for the attack. Mark I, the very first combat tank ever built, 28 feet long, 8 feet tall, 28 tons, armed either with 2 naval 6-pounder guns and 4 machine guns, what they called a male tank, or 6 machine guns only, the female, maximum speed, 3.7 miles per hour, walking pace. The crew of 8 men worked inside a sealed steel box where temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, where carbon monoxide from the engine mixed with gun fumes so thick that crews sometimes lost consciousness, where the noise was so extreme that crewmen communicated by hitting each other with hammers. These were the conditions in which the first tank crews went to war. Of the 49 tanks allocated, only 32 made it to the start line. The rest had broken down in transit. Of those 32, only 18 actually went into action. The others ditched in shell craters or seized up in the first minutes. What those 18 did, no weapon had ever done. One of the tank commanders, Gunner William Dawson, recalled, "Our tank commander was Second Lieutenant McPherson, a fine and likable young fellow, but he, like all of us, had never been on a battlefield or in action before. Indeed, that was the position of practically the whole of the 32 tanks which took part in this first action. The briefing and instructions regarding objectives were quite inadequate, and there was little or no cooperation between the infantry and the tanks." These were not veterans. They were young men operating an untested machine with inadequate briefings, no coordination plan, and a vehicle built in under a year, and they still broke the German line. In the village of Flers, one tank drove directly down the main street, guns firing left and right. The German garrison scattered and ran. A British Royal Flying Corps pilot, watching from above, sent a dispatch that became one of the most famous lines of the entire war. "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind it." Walking up the high street with the British Army cheering behind it. The villages of Flers and Courcelette were captured that day. The total advance was limited roughly 2,500 yards. Not the decisive breakthrough Haig had hoped for, but the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever tanks advanced, British forces took their objectives. Where tanks didn't advance, they failed. Haig's response was 3 words: make more tanks. Now, here is what history books almost always skip past. What did the German soldiers actually see? What did they actually think? What did they write home about? The British press reported it like this: when the German outposts crept out of their dugouts in the mist of the morning of the 15th of September and stretched to look for the English, their blood was chilled to their veins. 2 mysterious monsters were crawling towards them over the craters. Stunned as if an earthquake had burst around them, they all rubbed their eyes, which were fascinated by the fabulous creatures. That's propaganda, written by a British journalist. The real German accounts are far more revealing and far stranger, because only a small number of German soldiers at Flers-Courcelette actually faced the tanks directly. The machines were so few and spread so thin that the vast majority of German troops in the Somme sector never saw one that day. What spread through the German army wasn't the tanks themselves. It was the letters, the rumours, the stories passed trench to trench. Those letters survive, and they tell us something extraordinary. German historians who have studied this written record describe total confusion in how German soldiers described what tanks actually looked like. Listen to these accounts carefully. A soldier serving in Field Artillery Regiment No. 13, one of the Württemberg artillery units that fought directly at Flers-Courcelette, wrote home to his parents just days after the battle. He wrote, terrible hours lie behind me. On the 15th of September, we stalled an English attack. We also destroyed an armoured automobile. It was curiously X-shaped and powered by two enormous shovels which dug into the ground, pulling the vehicle forward. He thought the tracks were shovels. Other accounts said tanks could hold up to 40 infantrymen inside. Others said they were firing mines, not shells. Some described them as square, some as round, some as things so large they covered the entire width of a trench. Not one German account from September the 15th, 1916, accurately describes what a Mark I tank actually looks like. This wasn't stupidity. This wasn't ignorance. This was genuine terror distorting human perception. These were trained soldiers, experienced men, and they couldn't agree on what they'd seen because what they'd seen had no reference point in human experience. There was no category for it, no word that fit. The Mark I tank existed completely outside the boundaries of anything they had been trained to face. The description of an X-shaped tank powered by shovels, that specific myth, continued to circulate in official German army evaluation reports and combat intelligence documents until early 1917. Not in letters home, in official army reports. The German army called what followed Panzerschreck. Tank fear. Not fear of a specific weapon. Fear of a concept. Fear of something that seemed impossible, something bullets couldn't stop, that barbed wire couldn't slow, that walked through trenches as if they weren't there. German casualty data from every engagement involving British tanks shows significantly higher prisoner numbers than engagements without tanks. Not just more dead, more surrendered. Hardened soldiers throwing down weapons and giving up rather than face the machines. The phrase that circulated through the German trenches in the weeks after Flers was "Der Teufel kommt." The devil is coming. The German army was not passive. They adapted. Fast. By October the 21st, 1916, just 5 weeks after first contact, Army Group Crown Prince Ruprecht had issued the first formal anti-tank manual in military history. How to combat enemy tanks. It specified rifle fire, useless. Single grenades, useless. But grenades bundled together with string and wire, thrown at the tracks effective. And 7.7 centimeter field guns firing direct, point blank, highly effective. 50 dedicated anti-tank artillery batteries were formed. The new Hindenburg Line fortifications, begun in late 1916, had their trenches deliberately widened to make them harder for tanks to cross. Design work on Germany's own tank, the A7V, was begun, and then, in April 1917, the Germans got their hands on a real British tank. During the Battle of Arras, a Mark II tank designation 799 was knocked out at Bulcourt and left behind German lines. The Germans reached it safely. It became, briefly, something of a tourist attraction for curious German soldiers. Then it was measured, photographed, stripped of parts, and subjected to detailed analysis. SMK armor-piercing bullets were fired at its hull. The bullets went straight through. Germany's conclusion: tanks are slow, immobile, and easily destroyed. The SMK round can reliably penetrate armor at normal combat ranges. Tanks are a limited threat. Several anti-tank batteries were disbanded. The A7V program was scaled back. This wasn't caution. This was catastrophic overconfidence. Here's what they didn't know. Tank 799 was a Mark II. The Mark II was a training tank. It was never supposed to go to war. It had no armor plating. The British were so desperately short of tanks in early 1917 that they sent unarmored training vehicles to the front line. Germany had captured a target dummy and concluded they'd solved the problem. When the improved Mark IV arrived later in 1917, German SMK bullets bounced off it harmlessly. The anti-tank batteries that had been stood down had to be reformed in panic. The A7V program, cut back too far, could never recover. Here's where that failure becomes historic in scale. Germany, ultimately built 20 A7V tanks for the entire war. 20. Britain built over 2,500. France built over 3,800. Germany, 20. This wasn't a gap in industrial capacity. Germany had the steel, the factories, the engineers. The A7V's own crew of 18 men was proof they could build complex armored vehicles when they chose to. The failure was doctrinal, not industrial. Germany had been misled by a single captured training tank and chose to believe what it wanted to believe, that the tank problem was already solved. It wasn't solved. It was about to get catastrophically worse. By mid-1917, German confidence had returned. Their anti-tank tactics were working well enough. French tanks had performed disastrously at the Chemin des Dames in April. The threat looked manageable. November the 20th, 1917. Cambrai. 476 tanks. At dawn. No artillery, pre-bombardment for the first time in the war. No warning. Moving silently through morning mist toward German lines that had no idea what was coming. In a single day, the British advanced 6 miles on a 6-mile front. More ground taken in hours than across the entire 4-month Battle of the Somme. Church bells rang in London for the first time since the war began. German General Erich Ludendorff wrote, "A panic had spread throughout the front." The Panzerschreck was back. Only this time, it wasn't rumour and letters. It was 476 machines in formation. Cambrai proved what some British commanders had argued for over a year. Mass tanks, properly deployed, could break any defensive line on the Western Front. The entire strategic logic of trench warfare, that defenders would always defeat attackers, was wrong. It had always been wrong. It just needed enough tanks to prove it. Germany paid the full price in 1918. August 8th, 1918. The Battle of Amiens. 456 tanks attacked at dawn alongside infantry, artillery, and aircraft in the most sophisticated combined arms offensive the world had ever seen. The German front line collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered. Some divisions surrendered without fighting at all. Ludendorff called it der Schwarze Tag, the Black Day of the German army. Not because of the casualty numbers. Other days had been bloodier. Because of what it revealed. The German army, on that morning, lost faith in its own ability to win. The 100 days offensive that followed drove Germany back continuously until armistice. November the 11th, 1918. Tanks didn't win the First World War alone. Infantry won it. Artillery won it. Logistics won it. Starvation and exhaustion won it, but tanks ended it. Faster than anyone thought possible. Here's a question worth sitting with. What if Germany had taken tanks seriously after September the 15th, 1916? Not panicked. Not invented myths about X-shaped vehicles powered by shovels. Not drawn the wrong lesson from an unarmored training tank at Bullecourt. What if the German army had looked at those 18 machines crossing the Somme and immediately committed to building 500 of their own? Germany had the industrial base, the steel, the engineering talent. The A7V, for all its flaws, was a formidable machine with a 57mm cannon and 6 machine guns. A German tank program started in late 1916 and pursued seriously could have produced hundreds of vehicles by 1918. The 100 Days Offensive, the campaign that ended the war, was only possible because the Allies had armored superiority. Without it, those final months look very different. Here's what makes that failure haunting. 20 years later, Germany did not make the same mistake. The lesson of WW1 tank warfare was studied obsessively, not by the men who were there, but by a new generation of German military thinkers. The concept of massed armored assault combined with motorized infantry and close air support, what the world would call blitzkrieg, was built directly on the blueprint the British had first drawn at Cambrai. Germany's most feared military achievement of the Second World War grew from studying its most consequential failure in the First. The tanks that terrified German soldiers in 1916 taught the German army everything it needed to know about modern warfare. They just learned it 20 years too late. 18 tanks crossed no man's land on September the 15th, 1916. Half of those 18 broke down before firing a shot. And yet in the weeks that followed, German soldiers were describing them as X-shaped monsters, powered by shovels, filing those descriptions in official army intelligence reports, and using a French phrase that meant, "The devil is coming." The weapon was crude, unreliable, slow enough to outrun on foot. The idea behind it was unstoppable. Germany had the chance to match it. They had the factories, the men, and the time. Instead, they were misled by myths, by rumour, and by a single captured training tank with no armour plating. They built 20 tanks and called the problem solved. If Germany had built 500, if they had looked at Flers and understood what was really crossing their lines, does the war end differently? Does November 11th, 1918 still happen? Let me know what you think in the comments.